All right, hello, my name is Eric Koleda, and today I'm going to be telling you a tale of two APIs, sharing some lessons I learned about API change management from my time at Google. So I'm just going to jump right to the two main takeaways of my talk, and they are, number one, never make a breaking change to your API. Number two is constantly make breaking changes to your API. All right, those are obviously contradictory statements, but let me get into my talk and hopefully I'll make it make a bit more sense. Quickly about me, I am been in developer relations roles for the last 16 years, working at Google, Coda, and now currently Grammarly. During that time, I usually focus on APIs related to productivity suites. So that's where there's a user-facing product and then a companion API. And during my time, I've got to work with dozens of different API teams, and I've gotten to see a lot of different ways that they handle change. And I think the first is that change is inevitable, right? If you have a popular API that sticks around for a while, eventually you're going to need to deal with change, right? That change can come from different places. Sometimes the underlying product feature set evolves, and the API needs to evolve with it. For instance, maybe when you launched, a project only had a one owner, and so you modeled it that way in your API, and then they change it so they could have multiple owners. How do you adapt your API to handle that new reality? Sometimes it's about the internal architecture changing, right? Maybe for either security or modernization purposes, the engineering team is changing how the API is built, right? Maybe they're moving to a new technology like JSON RPC, right? So in that case, you need to evolve your API. And then as a developer advocate, what I love is when we actually evolve an API to meet the needs of the developer community, right? We listen to their feedback and we adapt it to kind of work better for them, right? So nowadays, with the rise of LLMs, streaming has become more important, right? Getting data to your API more quickly. So maybe you're adding new endpoints or changing how they work to work with streaming, right? So I think if you have a great API, you're going to need to wrestle with change eventually. And you can design for change up front, right? So if you build interfaces that are flexible, let's say using objects instead of primitive types, then you could add new fields that add new metadata so that you can kind of clarify and adapt to new behaviors. Or you can split your functionality into a more granular set of endpoints so that there's not as tight coupling between, let's say, every contact has one address. Well, if you model addresses separately, then you can kind of change that relationship over time. But I think at the end of the day, every design has some embedded assumptions. You can't get out of the business of making assumptions and tying it to a certain way of thinking about the product or the API. That can be like relationships between entities or hierarchy, right? Well, every task belongs to a project, right? Some of those may seem immutable when you get started, but over time, when features change, even some of those base level assumptions can break. And I think when you're designing for change and you're building in flexibility, it can sometimes come at the cost of simplicity, right? Are you making it easier to change it in the future at the cost of making it harder to use in the present? So I'm going to quick example here. These aren't the two APIs that my talk is named after, but these will kind of show a little bit of that trade-off. So Google owns Fitbit. Fitbit is the wearable tracker. I actually am wearing one now that measures your steps. And the Fitbit API allows you to make a simple REST call, passing in activities, steps, and due dates. And you get back an array of values, right? Pretty simple. I think this is a very nice, clean API. But it wouldn't be Google if they didn't have multiple products that do the same thing. And so Google also has Google Fit, kind of a companion set of products and tools. And Google Fit has a very different way of accessing this same data. So in Google Fit, you make a post request to an aggregate endpoint. Okay, a little technical jargon, but not so bad. You pass in the start and end in milliseconds. Okay, a little more precise. Then you aggregate by this ridiculously long string for estimated steps, and you bucket your time very specifically into days, right? This is very precise, very extensible, but wow, that's a lot more to send in. And then what you get out, well, what you get out is a bucket of data sets, of points, of values, of int vals, right? A lot more deeply nested with a lot more room of metadata you have to get through. Now, at the end of the day, the data is there, a developer can access it, but it's just that much more laborious to kind of get started, right? So I think the Google Fit API, way more flexible, but really a lot harder to use straight out of the gate. I think it's about prioritization, right? When you're making some of these choices, there's trade-offs. And so who are you prioritizing, right? Existing developers or new developers, I think, is one dimension. So you don't want to break everyone who's adopted your platform so far. But if you kind of freeze the API, you end up perhaps freezing in outdated terminology, right? Like something's still called a project in your API, but now it's called a team in your UI. Or maybe you've added new ways of behavior over time as the product evolved, but you've hidden all those behind extra parameters, like you need to do / enable new feature equals true in order to get the new behavior, right? New developers aren't going to find that. They're going to stumble. You're kind of creating friction in your adoption. I think another thing that you have to sometimes balance between is, keeping it stable versus having velocity, internal velocity, allowing your eng teams to build new features quickly, right? It's usually considered a bad idea to design an API around your org chart, right? Kind of representing your internal team structure in your API. But it does allow you to move faster. Teams having kind of clear lines of ownership allows them to, build quickly and get features out the door sooner. Although that can then, of course, lead to something like API sprawl, where every team is doing things differently or has overlapping features that are implemented in different ways. Having more managed growth, kind of more carefully growing your API, gives a better overall product, but perhaps at the cost of speed. All right, now I pitched the two APIs here in the title. I want to get into those two APIs now, because I think they show two very different ways of handling change management for an API that bring to light some of the underlying factors to consider. So let's meet our characters. So first, the first team I joined when I joined Google was our AdWords API team. So AdWords, I think now called Google Ads, was Google's product that allowed people to buy ads on Google.com and other properties, those little text boxes above search. And this API was really aimed at really large companies that needed to automate their bidding. So your average mom and pop or even medium-sized advertiser would just click through other tools. They wouldn't need to use this kind of raw API. And being kind of like a legacy business product, it was built on SOAP at the time, an old technology, really complex. It had so many fields and settings, and it was contributed by from a ton of different dev teams, all spread out. So it was really quite a thing to work with. I then moved, after a couple of years on that product, moved to Google AppScript. Very different. This is a tool that allows, it's part of the Google Workspace suite. It's like the productivity suite of Google. It allows people to kind of create scripts and automations. It's akin to Visual Basic for the kind of Excel or Microsoft suite. And I think the main audience here, you can think of them more as like spreadsheet wizards, right? These aren't people who necessarily code all the time, but they want to automate their work. They're the ones building those spreadsheets that like secretly power half your company and no one knows where they're buried. And this was a way for them to kind of enhance those workflows to add some more automation. What it looked like in practice, it's a JavaScript runtime on the cloud with built-in libraries for different Google products so that you could easily grab data from a Google Drive, send it to a sheet, and so on. Now, how they handled change was very different. So for AdWords API, I call their model the hamster wheel, right? That's the little hamster runs in place, never gets anywhere. So they took an approach of like every 4 months, sometimes as few as every 2 months, releasing a brand new version, kind of a new major version even. There was potentially breaking changes for every new release. And those came at you every couple of months. And in order to keep you running on that hamster wheel, they said, we're only supporting the newest 3 versions. So if you didn't keep upgrading to the newer versions, eventually your integration would break. That would mean, depending upon the frequency, if it came at 2 months or 3 months or 4 months, you could be doing 1 to 2 migrations per year, maybe more if you really try to stay on the latest. That's a lot, right? That's a lot to ask of your developers to constantly be going back to their code and changing out how it works. And I think, it took a lot of effort internally to communicate, educate, and then, help validate that all of their upgrades were working, as well as obviously a ton of work on our developer audience who needed to constantly be devoting eng time to doing this upgrading. So a pretty onerous process and one that came with a lot of costs on all sides. Now, contrast that to AppScript. I'm calling this frozen in amber, right? They said, we have these core libraries that integrate with Google services. They have no versions. There are no releases. There is no ability for someone to opt in or to migrate. And what that meant was we almost never introduced a breaking change. Almost all of our changes were additive, and we tried extremely hard to never do anything that would be backwards incompatible. Doing this over the span of, like, it's been around for over a decade, is a very big challenge, right? Obviously, all of the change I mentioned earlier, it's still coming at you, but we had to preserve in time these interfaces, these libraries, with no changes, at least no breaking changes. And obviously, that was difficult on our engineering team. It took a lot of bending over backwards to kind of hide some of those changes and keep the same outward-facing technology for our developers. Now you can say, how can the same company have such radically different approaches to handling change management, right? And I think if you've been at any big company, you know that everything is done in little pockets. There's not usually a global plan that everyone operates by. But I think in this case, this isn't just a factor of these teams being separate from each other. I think it actually ties back to some of the underlying factors and kind of flavors of those different APIs and who's using them. So I'm going to talk about 3 different aspects of these APIs and how they influence these decisions around change management. So the first is the audience. So who are the developers that use these different developer tools? So for the AdWords API, we're talking about pro devs, at large organizations. These are your professionals that know how to structure code, know how to build things in a supportable way, right? And they're familiar with all the best practices around building up tests and suites of other QA and acceptance that make sure that when they can do these large swaps and know that they're actually working. And they're people that are constantly in their code base. They're there probably doing all sorts of updates throughout the year. So it's kind of like very familiar in their minds, kind of how the code works. Contrast that with your AppScript developer, right? These are people that we call citizen developers, right? Their main job is not programming. They maybe took a course in college. They hack on the weekends. Nowadays, they're using LLMs, I'm sure. And they're just getting by with code, right? What they write can often be kind of not the prettiest code, right? They kind of just get it working and then leave. They're not tidying it up. They're not adding tests. It's kind of like set it and forget it, right? And the whole thing is there's no institutional knowledge. There's not checked in code somewhere. No one knows where the scripts are. They're just kind of scattered about, right? So you can see these two audiences, they're primed differently to be able to handle a migration. I think if you threw a big migration at an AppScript developer, they're not really in a place where they can have a lot of confidence that they'll be able to do a major swap to their code and know that it's still working correctly. Second is our relationship to these developers, right? How does the company relate to them? So for the AdWords API, everyone who came to use that API had a really strong business need, right? Like they needed to advertise on Google. This was the only game in town. And so we had a captive developer audience, right? They couldn't leave to go to some other API. There was no other API that would post your ads onto Google. So they really had to stick around, even if we kind of made them jump through all these hoops. And we also just had a deeper connection to each of these companies, right? So we had people on the customer, partner, and developer side who kind of maintain consistent lines of communication. So we had the ability to kind of push messages to them and get them right to the audience that needed to hear them, but also hear their feedback and adapt maybe some of what we were doing. Contrast that with AppScript, right? The audience is much larger. There are like millions of users who have built a script. And these integrations, they're not quite as business critical. Like sometimes they do power parts of your business that you don't realize they do, but they're typically additive, right? Like someone built a spreadsheet and they want a new row to be added every day, or they want a form to trigger something. It could have been done manually. This just makes it easier, but it's not necessarily core to the business goals. And there are competing products, right? There's Zapier, there's Make, there's a whole bunch of other tools you can use to automate things. If this platform was one that kind of required a lot of upkeep, people might turn somewhere else. And when we wanted to reach out and contact people, there just wasn't a clear point of contact, right? Sometimes a script was written by a marketing person in the department 4 years ago who now is on another team. It's not clear who you can reach out to if something needs to be upgraded. So our ability to get the word out and also our ability to kind of nudge them along was just very different between these audiences. And the last thing I think is, what are our goals as a company? What are we getting out of this relationship, right? For the AdWords API, a ton of spend passed through the API. Right? These were our biggest customers and partners. And this integration was really critical to us as well as them. And the AdWords product teams would build out new features to help boost click-through rates, to make it so that more ads reach the right people. And those new features couldn't really be utilized by everyone unless they flowed through to these other applications that were integrating with us, right? And so we needed to have these applications kind of keep bringing new versions of the API into their app to keep getting the new kind of features through to the end user so that we would actually see that difference in click-through rate and therefore revenue. So it was actually really important to us that these features that we built into the API made it to the end users. With AppScript, on the other hand, there wasn't a direct revenue stake for every script run or built. Instead, what we're looking for is just increasing customer happiness, right? This is part about creating a more robust suite for users. And people just wanted to set up their automations and workflows and forget about it. And it was that kind of forget about it that was part of the value for them. And then it created stickiness for us, because the more secret hidden scripts there are around your business, the harder it's going to be to churn. And also the more happy you're going to be with our product. So really the kind of value for us came from not rocking the boat too much and allowing them to just keep working the way that it worked always. So I think if you look at these three aspects, you can see that these audiences were just and goals were just very different for the two different products. And so you can kind of see how it makes sense we would take some very different approaches to change management. So what does this mean for your APIs, right? I would say, first of all, this is not a playbook. I would not just pick up one of these two tactics and deploy it tomorrow. These are extremes, right? I think both came with high costs, internally or externally or both. And you probably don't just want to pick one of these off the shelf and apply it to what you're doing with your APIs. But I do think you can broaden your horizons a bit with these examples, right? Realize that there's not just one pattern, and that you don't have to just do it one way. There is a lot of diversity to how you can handle change management, and it's really about tailoring it to your needs. So I guess to go back, I would probably say there are three takeaways. That some APIs never make breaking changes, and some constantly do. And what you should do is whatever makes the most sense for your audience, your relationship to them, and the goals you have for your API. All right, that's it for me today. If you want to connect with me, I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Blue Sky. Thank you so much for watching.